Hello and welcome to Tête-à-Tête, France 24's flagship interview show. Our guest today is Vladimir Kara-Murza. He's a Russian opposition figure. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
After surviving two suspected poisoning attempts a decade ago, in 2023, you were sentenced to 25 years in jail in Russia for treason after accusing in public, I quote, the dictatorial regime in the Kremlin of committing war crimes in Ukraine. But in August 2024, after more than 2 years behind bar, you were released in the largest prisoner exchange between Russia and the West since the Cold War. First, I would like you to recount, if possible, your time in jail. I believe you spent 1 year in total isolation.
Yes, so 2.5 years I spent in prison overall, a year of which was spent in solitary confinement in Siberia, in Omsk, in the best or perhaps in the worst traditions of our country, a place that has held political prisoners since Tsarist times and again in Soviet times and again today under Vladimir Putin. And in fact, the conditions that political prisoners are held in our country have not changed. And when I was rereading some of the memoirs by Soviet dissidents when I was in prison, people like Vladimir Bukovsky, Natan Sharansky, and others who were in prison half a century ago, I had this most surreal feeling of actually living inside one of those books, because it's astonishing how much everything in the Russian Gulag system has remained exactly the same as it was back then. You know, the way prison guards speak to you, the way your prison day is structured, the way your cell is fitted, and so on. Just like the political prisoners of old, whom the regime in the Kremlin considers to be, quote-unquote, particularly dangerous, I was held in total isolation, constant solitary confinement. You sit in this small cell, about 3 by 4 meters, 4 walls. You have a small metal-barred window under the ceiling. Your bunk gets attached to the wall at 5 o'clock in the morning with a wake-up call, and then you cannot take it down again until the lights out at 9 p.m. So you're given a pen and paper to write only for 1.5 hours, and they take it away again. So everything you have to do, like preparing for court hearings, reading documents and so on, you have to squeeze into that hour and a half. And all you can do for the rest of the day is essentially just walk around aimlessly in this small circle around the cell. You know, there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do. But worst of all, there's no one to speak to. As you know, by international law, the United Nations Standard Minimal Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, also known as the Nelson Mandela Rules, prolonged solitary confinement is officially equated to torture. I had known about this rule for a long time because I engaged in advocacy on behalf of political prisoners for many, many years. I'd known about this rule, but I cannot say I really understood it. I certainly do now. You know, Aristotle once wrote that we human beings are social animals. We need interaction with each other, human contact, just as much as we need, you know, oxygen to breathe, the water to drink. And when a human being is so much as totally deprived of any human contact, well, I'll be honest about it, you start going crazy. You start forgetting names, you start forgetting even the simplest words, you start shouting at walls, you stop understanding the difference between what's real and what's imagined. And it takes a special effort in these conditions to maintain one's sanity. And thankfully, I had the benefit of knowing about, reading about the experience of Soviet dissidents. I had the honor of knowing many of these people in person. And so the key here is you have to occupy your mind with something practical, something constructive. You have to channel your mental energy into something, not to get crazy. So I managed to get a hold of a Spanish textbook. I was allowed one book with me when I was in solitary confinement and punishment cell. And I was just sitting there morning till evening, just constantly, you know, reading, rereading, learning, memorizing, and so on. Just to maintain my sanity. I never, of course, hoped that I would ever be able to use any of that Spanish. But you know, in the worst case, I thought that if I did go crazy, I'd at least be able to shout at my prison guards in a perfect Castilian dialect.
Did you fear you would die in jail like Alexei Navalny, especially since you believe Vladimir Putin tried to eliminate you in the past, as I referred in 2015, 2017? You believe you were poisoned. This is what happened to Alexei Navalny. You thought this would be the same with you at some point?
Well, first of all, I don't just believe I was poisoned. Bellingcat, the International Investigative Media Group, actually identified the names of specific FSB officers who poisoned me, first in 2015, then in 2017, the same people who were behind the poisoning of Alexei Navalny back in 2020, the first time he was poisoned. Let's not forget, when we're speaking about Vladimir Putin, we're speaking not only about a usurper, an illegitimate usurper, not only about a dictator, he is all of those things, but he's also a murderer in a very direct and literal sense of this term. There's a special unit within the Russian security services whose job it is to physically eliminate opponents of Vladimir Putin. It was Vladimir Putin, I have no doubt, who ordered the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, the leading opposition figure in Russia back in 2015. It was Vladimir Putin personally, I have no doubt, who ordered the murder of Alexei Navalny last year in a Siberian, in an Arctic penal colony prison. In fact, you know, I was absolutely certain, it's not just that I thought, I was absolutely certain I was going to die in that prison in Omsk. The prisoner exchange that took place in August of 2024, negotiated by several Western governments, but primarily the governments of the United States at the time and Germany. It was a miracle, in my view. This is how I still describe it to this day, but it was in so many ways a human-made miracle because it was made possible by so many good people in democratic nations who never stopped advocating for all of those who were locked up in Putin's prisons simply for speaking out against his criminal war of aggression in Ukraine. And it was a very clear and very powerful message sent by Western governments in that exchange that they know who the real criminals are. They know that the real criminals are those people who are sitting in the Kremlin who are waging this war, not those of us who are in prison because we had opposed it.
During the closing session of your trial in April 2023, this is what you told the court. I subscribe to every word I've spoken and for which I've been accused by this court. I blame myself for only one thing, that over the years I have not managed to convince enough of my compatriots and enough politicians in democratic countries of the danger of the regime in the Kremlin for Russia and the world. So first of all, how do you explain that you are not able to convince the Russians? Vladimir Putin's hold on power seems to be solid.
Well, first of all, let's not forget that Russia today is a full-scale dictatorship, where there are no independent media that would not be controlled by the state, where parliament is a mere rubber stamp that unanimously approves every order that comes from the Kremlins. Well, you know what? We have a record number of political prisoners in Russia. It is a shocking and sobering fact that there are more political prisoners in Russia today, in Russia alone, than there were in the whole of the Soviet Union, that is 15 different countries put together in the mid-1980s. And the fastest growing category of political prisoners in Russia are those of my fellow citizens, those of my fellow Russian citizens who have spoken out publicly against Putin's war in Ukraine. Because as you know, it is a quote-unquote criminal offense in Russia to speak out against this war. And while on the one hand it is heartbreaking, you know, according to Memorial, the leading human rights organization in Russia, there are more than 4,500 people today in Russia who are imprisoned on politically motivated grounds. More than 1,700 known identified political prisoners by name. Every day on average, 5 people in Russia are targeted with different forms of political repression, either criminal, administrative, police detentions, and so on, 5 people a day. And as I mentioned, the fastest growing category in this list are those Russians who are speaking out against the war in Ukraine. And while on the one hand, it is totally heartbreaking to look at these stories, to hear these horrible statistics, on the other hand, it actually makes me proud of my country that there are so many people in Russia who are not willing to look the other way, who are not willing to remain silent in the face of this atrocity, even if it means losing their own personal freedom.
What about the Western world? I mean, we heard over the years many European leaders, American leaders, George W. Bush for one, you know, say, okay, Putin might be different, but he is okay. Do you think that this has changed now because of the war in Ukraine, at least in Europe, or there are still politicians who do believe Putin is someone you should deal with?
I think the greatest help that Putin had in the early years that he was in power, when he was establishing this dictatorship that I just described, help came from 2 different sources. One was domestic indifference in Russia. A lot of people chose to focus on their personal lives, on the economic issues, bread and butter issues, and just sort of look the other way when it came to politics. And that really helped Putin along the way to building this totalitarian regime. But the other great help came from Western leaders, who for years and years, Western leaders on both sides of the Atlantic, both in Europe and in America, who for many years engaged in the shameful policy of appeasement, of enabling of Vladimir Putin's regime. You mentioned George W. Bush, who, you know, looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul. Barack Obama, a president from another party, infamously pressed the reset button with Putin just after he invaded Georgia. You know, there were cases like former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who literally sold himself to Vladimir Putin in the most direct sense of this term. He started working for Putin's energy companies when he left office. But the problem is, to answer your question, however astonishing this is, no, it hasn't ended today. Even now that we're almost 4 years into the largest military conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War, which is what Putin is doing in Ukraine, we are still seeing, for example, the current president of the United States continuing this policy of enabling and appeasement of Putin, and essentially now pushing Ukraine, pressing Ukraine into a capitulation to Putin, because this so-called 28-point peace plan that we saw the Trump administration present a few weeks ago, I mean, that's not a peace plan. This is Vladimir Putin's Christmas wish list, because this is everything that he wants, you know, getting territory he hasn't been able to seize militarily, precluding Ukraine joining NATO, a full amnesty for war crimes, which is totally unacceptable. I believe every single Russian war criminal has to be held to account after all of this is over. This is important not just for Ukraine, it's important for us too, because Russia is not going to have a normal democratic future without these war criminals being held accountable. So yes, I believe the policy of the current US administration towards Putin is shameful. I believe it is unacceptable, it is unprincipled, it is immoral
kicking Russian
and
opposition
cynical.
figures and asylum seekers out of the US as well.
That too. I mean, well, several dozen people, including the latest example just a few days ago, were deported from the U.S. And some of them, at least that we know of, by specifically, were arrested straight from the plane
Or sent
when they
to
came in,
the front line.
and sent to prison. At least there was one anti-war activist, one conscientious objector. Those are the ones we know of. But coming back to your question about the West, yes, I think this policy is absolutely shameful, because if there is one very clear lesson from the 20th century, it is that appeasing a dictator never leads to actual peace. I think a lot of your viewers will remember the images of Neville Chamberlain, waving that piece of paper after he came back from Munich in 1938. How did that one work out? The only language aggressors, dictators understand is the language of strength and principle. And if America in its current form is not willing to lead on this, then Europe must.
Vladimir Kara-Murza, thank you very much for being our guest here on Tête à Tête, and thanks to you for watching this edition. Stay tuned for more news here on France 24.